All right, we're here now with Dr. Amelia Wirts. Dr. Wirts, thank you for coming on the program. We appreciate your time, and I'm really excited about being able to talk about this blog post that was on the American Philosophical Association's blog that was from a previous presentation that you did on policing. But I'm excited to talk with you, so thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So let's talk about your piece, which is about
hmm
policing as an oppressive institution. Um, you argue in the paper that and that became the blog piece that your view is that, quote, policing in the United States is inherently oppressive, close quote. Could you explain what you mean by that? What does it mean to say that policing is oppressive?
hmm Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I think one of the ways that I like to start out when I talk about oppression is to say, um, oppression is a sort of theory that was developed by a lot of feminist philosophers and legal scholars, and usually what we mean by oppression um, is that there's a sort of a certain group of people who experience regularly different kinds of obstacles because they belong to to the certain social group. In this case, I talk about criminalized people, people who are, whether or not they've actually committed a crime, are treated as if they are criminals. And so that's what I mean by oppressive, is that there's a group-based harm and that it's reinforced by all kinds of different structures, social norms, laws, little everyday practices, whether those are things like something that's a literal law written in a book or something that's almost like a social script, like we might know that we avoid a certain neighborhood of town because it's a dangerous neighborhood, right? Little small everyday things, or even things like police procedurals that are so popular and have been popular in different forms for decades, right? That we watch these shows and we sort of think about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So sort of social scripts around what it means to be a criminal. So there's those sorts of things, and then there are all kinds of things like that are a little bit more concrete and specific, like specific laws, um, specific Supreme Court cases, and those kinds of things that also work um, to reinforce obstacles for a certain group of people, certain social group of people. So that's when I say oppression, I'm talking about that system of interconnected obstacles that includes obstacles that are shaped by sort of these common social norms and stories that we tell ourselves, and these sort of specific institutions and laws. So that's what I mean by oppression, and I think a lot of feminist theorists have been developing, more and more nuanced ways of talking about what that means. And so I really draw in my work in general on those folks. And so I think policing, when I say policing is inherently oppressive, I think policing is not policing in the United States. I'm speaking within the United States context here. Um, Policing is not the kind of thing that we can clean up. It's inherent. It is one of those systems of oppression. So it's not something that we could take little parts out that are bad. It is itself an oppressive system. So that's what I meant by inherently oppressive. It's that the oppression, the sort of the bad, unjust things that come out of policing, are not separable from policing itself.
So, if I understand this correctly, and please correct me if I'm
Mhm.
wrong, you're saying that there's something about the nature of police forces, at least in the United States, that exercises a certain kind of power in our society that you think results or ripples into unjust harm on different populations of people in the United States. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, I think that's a good summary.
Okay. So I want to understand this, the nature of, I mean, how you understand policing in general to sort of understand that claim of yours. And in your blog piece, you state that there are at least three different positions that you might take in reaction to police killing of unarmed Black people in the United States, for instance. Um, and these three views are meant to sort of address the question of whether or not policing is in fact systematically oppressive or not. The first view that you unpack is what you call the bad apples view, and the second one is what you call the bundle of bad practices view. And but ultimately, you think that both of these practices are just really bad takes on the situation of the killing of unarmed Black people, right? So the bad
Mhm.
apples view and the bundle of bad practices view, just bad ways of thinking about the oppressive nature of police. So,
Mhm.
given that you make arguments for both of those positions, I was wondering if you could explain each of these views, the bad apples view and the bundle of bad practices view. Because I think that when many people have been thinking, at least in the last year or so, they have versions of each of these views in mind when they're thinking of how to think about the questions about like George Floyd and Ferguson,
Yeah.
Missouri, and so forth.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could explain, for instance, first the bad apples view. What do you think is wrong in the way that the bad apples view understands state-sanctioned violence?
Yeah. So when I say the bad apples view here, what I have in mind is probably the folks who are most supportive of the police in general in the United States and of policing in general. And those folks have probably had like themselves mostly pretty good experiences with police. So, um, you know, experiences like the kind that I have had that are mostly the police usually treat me respectfully. I don't get stopped all the time for no reason, right? I get treated pretty respectfully. And so their experiences with police are that police are there to help. They have a really hard job, and so they make mistakes, and when we see something like that is just so phenomenally, like unbelievably bad, like when this video of Derek Chauvin killing, just callously killing George Floyd, they look at that and they're like, yes, there are a handful of bad police officers, and there that is tragic, and we should just absolutely, press. What we did with Derek Chauvin is good. We charged him. He's going to go to jail, to prison. He was found guilty. Like there's just, and that's right. We should just, but there really aren't that many. So this is the bad apples view. Um, that it's really just a few bad apples, and there aren't that many bad apples. And so that's the bad apples view. And so on that view, what you would do about the situation with George Floyd is George Floyd's murder, is exactly what happened. We prosecute Derek Chauvin for basically for I think he ended up secondary manslaughter. I should have double checked that one as a lawyer. I should have got the charges correct there. But we charge him, we punish him, and we use the criminal justice system to do it. Right? He committed a crime. We use the criminal justice system to fix it. Um, I should say the criminal legal system. I trying to get away from the phrase criminal justice system. So we use the criminal legal system to address that. So that's the bad apples view. And it really there, the idea is policing is mostly it's almost exclusively a good institution in the U.S. And most cops are just trying to do a really tough job. So
So the problem, it seems, though, from that, based on what you said before, is that the bad apples view doesn't take a systematic view
right.
of police in the United States. Is that the institution of policing, that is that there is a group of people who are sanctioned to be able to be law enforcement and use violence in the name of law enforcement, that is justified. And
Right.
if there are egregious cases of the use of that violence, it's the problem is a few individuals, not something
Yes.
systematic in the institution of policing itself. And
Yes.
you think
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
you think there's
And
something. What's wrong with that view, though? I mean,
so
isn't what's wrong with the view that there may be a few bad apples?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think that what it doesn't take into account is a lot of the more general problems that a lot of folks have been raising. So if you take the claims of a lot of folks in the Black Lives Matter movement seriously, as I do, um, the what happened to George Floyd was not a one-off incident. It was the ultimate escalation of practices that happen every day. So this is something that I note in the article. When we look at a couple other cases of police killings, um, the case of Philando Castile in Minneapolis, he had been pulled over 49 times, I think, in the last decade. Never given, I think he's never even given a citation. How can you? I have been pulled over twice in my life. Like, I can't even imagine what it's like to be pulled over 49 times. So if you just have, and I think that at most they gave him a small citation. So he's getting pulled over all the time for nothing serious. And so if you get pulled over 49 times by police officers and nothing, you don't even really get a ticket, or maybe at most you get a speeding ticket, you might start to feel harassed. Like, it's possible that it's likely you're gonna feel harassed, right? So I think what that few bad apples example doesn't, or that viewpoint doesn't account for the fact that when we talk to people who tend to share, Black people in this case, who are the disproportionately the victims of police killings, they say, what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Philando Castile, those things are culminations of other bad practices that have been happening in my life, and they're almost expected outcomes of continual interactions with police that happen over and over and over again. So I think the bad apples view becomes really implausible if you give even a shred of credence to the claims that the Black Lives Matter movement has made. So that's, in my view, the bad apples view is almost like not even worth talking about, to a certain extent, because I think if you're committed to that view, you've already decided that you just aren't going to listen to the claims of people who are showing up in the streets to express how much violence they're suffering at the hands of the state. So I think if you believe in the bad apples view, you already are dismissing the claims of a whole huge group of people, and so that, in my view, that's untenable, especially in 2021, if you've paid any attention at all to what's been going on.
So another way of saying maybe is that the evidence that's out there just doesn't bear out that theory that the problem with policing in the United States is that there's just a few really sadistic individuals here and there. Mm-hmm. Is that the problems that we're seeing and the testimony that we're hearing from communities of color who are systematically oppressed, that the bad apples you just certainly couldn't be true given the testimony that we're hearing.
Yeah, exactly.
So to understand a little bit, if the problem with the bad apples view is that the evidence just doesn't bear out what we are hearing from communities of color that are being affected by police practices, then another kind of view might be that the problem is not just the individuals who are police officers who are bad, but perhaps the problem is that maybe there are some policies in place in police departments that are oppressive. And if we just change those policies. And so the reason I'm thinking about this is, I'm thinking about, you're saying, part of what you were saying was that, if you're listening to the communities, Black communities in particular, that are being affected by this, that are voicing things through Black Lives Matter, they're saying, look, it's more than just a few bad individuals. There's something else going on here. Something like this was borne out not by just Black Lives Matter, but like the Department of Justice, after they did a review of Ferguson, Missouri, they showed that the reason that Black people were being pulled over so much was that there was a policy by the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department to track down Black drivers and to cite them. And part of this was that there was economic incentive to do this for the city. And so, so someone might look at something like the Department of Justice report and say, oh, the problem of policing is that there are these bad practices in police departments, and that leads to these kinds of oppressive situations like what was going on in Ferguson. And then you add it to questions like, what happened to Eric Garner, or as you were mentioning, to Philando Castile, and to all these people that, there's just these police departments that have these policies in place that are really harmful. And if we just change those policies, then things will get better. Um, but you claim that that this kind of view, what you call the bundle of bad practices view, you also think that that view is not quite adequate. Could you explain a little bit about why you think that that view is not adequate? Like, if we just review the policies and maybe change a few policies, then things won't be so bad with policing.
Yeah, I think that, as I said, I think there's something very attractive about this view, and it captures a lot that is true, right? Which is that there are practices in police departments across the United States that are explicitly racist. We have a lot of evidence about um, the mayor of New York City, Bloomberg, when he was in office, his explicit policies about racialized stop and frisk, which were criticized and justly criticized. And so there are some really explicitly bad policies. And then we also have things um, that might be race neutral, but are still still just bad practices, like the use of chokeholds that are unduly dangerous. Um, Rules about when and how to escalate violence that are either undefined or are too quick to escalate violence. Those sorts of things. And we might say like, I agree with the bundle. It's my own term. The bundle of bad practices view, to the extent that, of course, those are bad. Those are bad practices. But I think that the problem with viewing policing as primarily as the problems of policing as problems of bad policies is that these policies are all interconnected in a number of ways, and you can't take one out and expect that that things will get better. And Because these policies are in place because of the nature of policing itself. An example that I like to use is around no-knock warrants. There was a little bit of discussion around no-knock warrants, um, because there was some debate over whether or not the warrant that was used when Breonna Taylor was killed was a no-knock warrant or not. I think it had been a no-knock warrant, and then they decided it was a no. It was a regular warrant, so they should knock. But the whole thing there is that it doesn't matter whether we ban no-knock warrants, because the Supreme Court has said that you have to get a special no-knock warrant, um, and you have to have special reasons for having a no-knock warrant. But if you have just a regular warrant, the rule for what you can do to enforce to use that warrant to come into a home to search it, for example, is that you have to knock and announce. And you're like, oh, that sounds pretty good, right? Knock and announce. Let's say all warrants should be knock and announce warrants. Well, so what does that actually mean if you have to knock and announce? The Supreme Court has said, well, um, you have to knock and wait as long as it would take. Um, you don't have to wait forever. You don't have to wait 3 minutes. You just knock, and you can enter as soon as is necessary to prevent evidence from being destroyed. And in a particular case, I think it's 2003 US v. Banks, I believe. Um, they said, well, you were entering a drug house, and it takes only about 15 seconds to flush drugs down the toilet. So 15 seconds. So the rule is actually knock and announce, means you knock and then you can storm in within 15 seconds. So it's not, and so you might be like, well, that's just a bad Supreme Court ruling. We should just say like, okay, let's try to bring a case, or let's maybe make a federal statute that says no, you need to wait 2 or 3 minutes or something like that. But the whole reason for getting a search warrant is to get evidence. And so the Supreme Court is, pretty rationally interpreting the purpose of a search warrant. You can't let people have enough time to destroy the evidence that you came there to get with your search warrant. So it's not really that we have no knock warrants. And it's not really that we need to make a longer amount of time to between an announcement and an entry by police officers when they're using a search warrant. It's that the kinds of things that police officers do, which is gather evidence, is inherently like very intrusive and is very prone to leading to violence. And so the problem there, it's like you would actually undermine the goals of policing, the things that you would need to do to make the execution of a search warrant safe would undermine the whole point of a search warrant. And so what that example illustrates is that policing sort of has these inherent um, invasions of privacy, uses of force, and violence that are endemic to the practice of policing itself. And then if you look at a broader context of the United States, the more things that we make into crimes, the more things police have reason to search for, and the bigger police budgets get, the more warrants they can execute, and so you just get this proliferation of police activity. And there's no way to take all of the violence and intrusion of privacy out of policing away. It's inherent to policing itself because of what they're trying to do: search for evidence, lock people up. So anyway, so that's one example that I hope to show with that example is that the things that police do are themselves prone to violence, prone to intrusion of invasion of privacy, and we basically would render the police ineffective at what they're supposed to do if we put in all the rules that would actually make us be safe.
Wow. Okay. So, wow, that's quite intense. So, if I understand this correctly, what you're saying is that the problem with the bundle of bad practices view is that if you try to do all these different kind of reforms to make policing uh, not so violent and not so inherently oppressive, you would really gut the institution of policing in the United States and sort of render it incapable of achieving its mission.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely I agree with that. Yes,
Well,
that is
I mean,
what I'm
because
saying.
you
Yeah.
know, I put it that way because then the question, this gets to the view that you argue for in your paper, right? Which you call the oppressive systems view, is that if I could put this in another way, and I'll see what you think about this, is that you know the problem with the bad apples view is that it's not just a few bad apples. There's something much more systemic going on, and the evidence bears that out. And it's not just that there's a few bad practices and policies governing
Hmm.
policing. It's that there's something inherently oppressive about the mission of
Yes.
policing in the United States that is the cause of the kinds of killings that we're seeing all
Hmm.
across the country. That it's something about the very nature and the mission of policing that is a problem.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could explain a little bit. You call this view the oppressive systems view in your paper.
Hmm.
Can you explain why you think that this is better equipped to grasp the complex features of police killing in the United States?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I think is extremely essential to understand about policing in the United States and about the criminal legal system as a whole, so police, prosecutors, incarceration, probation, all that stuff, is that it purports to be about keeping people safe. And it purports to be about stopping people from committing crimes that are, harmful to society or to particular individuals. Um, and I'm not sure that it even can actually do that, but I'm going to grant for a moment that policing and the criminal legal system in the United States does keep some people safe. So let's presume, for the sake of argument, that it does. The problem is that it's keeping security as a good for just a small group of people at the cost of no-knock warrants, or I should say, of warrants, and of sort of aggressive police policies and stop and frisk and all of those other policies are for the sake of keeping a certain group of people safe and secure, or maybe just feeling safe and secure. And those people um, tend to be people who are honestly a lot like me, um, uh, middle class, white women who are cis and non-disabled in a lot of ways, right? So people like me are often the ones who we're seen as like almost impossible for us to be real criminals. So we're the ones for the safety is for, and we are being kept safe from other people. And of course, the people who are the most scary, sort of who are most likely to be put in a group and labeled as a criminal are especially young men, but all Black people, um, and a lot of Indigenous folks suffer in the same way, and also people with disabilities, and a lot of poor folks as well, of all races and genders. And so the idea is that this there's a privileged group and an oppressed group. And the privileged group, what we're getting is safety at um, the sort of cost of all of this harm and violence toward the oppressed group. And maybe we aren't even really getting safety. Maybe we're mostly getting the feeling of being safe. Um, and so I think one way to think about the oppressive systems view is that what's actually going on is the maldistribution, the unjust distribution of the good of safety or the feeling of safety. So something that we all deserve. We all deserve to be physically secure and safe, and this system is supposed to provide that. But really, it's only providing it, if at all, to a very small group of privileged people. And so I think to me, like that's the most important thing to take away from sort of the oppressive systems view. Why I think that's important is I think that people who are perhaps most able to make radical changes, not wonderful one-off policy changes, are people who have been benefiting the most from this system by either getting to feel safe or getting to be safe if we are in fact kept safer, which I'm not sure that we actually are kept safer. So I think I might have gotten a little bit off topic there,
No,
but that's to me an important takeaway, is that those of us who are privileged qua criminal, I like to say, like we are always going to be on the privileged side of the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system. It's on us to make the kinds of radical changes that are going to be necessary for us to have a more just society for everyone.
right. Well, so I mean, I think that this is pretty intense. So I want to sort of go back and try to fill this in to sort of get to where you're at with this notion of security. I mean, if we look at the one of the views that you dismiss, right, the bundles of bad practices view, it seems that a lot of our elected officials are sort of going along this route as possibilities for reform. So you saw, right, in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests and demonstrations going on in Minneapolis in 2020, a lot of politicians talking about doing various kinds of reforms like ending no-knock entries, the banning chokeholds across the country or increasing body camera usage and all this kind of stuff. There was also discussion about removing qualified immunity for police
Hmm.
officers. So there was a lot of movement towards different kinds of policy reforms from our elected officials. Is there any worth at all, in your view, to doing any of that kind of view, or should we just simply say, look, this is not the problem is the mission, the problem is the institution, and these things aren't really going to do anything? Is there any kind of value to these policy reforms in your view?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think I will. One thing I'll start by saying is I think the concern that I have about going for the types of policies that you state is that we will think we are doing something and that we can be like, oof, solve that problem, done, right? So we ban chokeholds, we ban no-knock warrants, we make sure every police officer has a body camera, um, we, maybe even, a lot of de-escalation training and implicit bias training, um, and we think that we've done the work and we move on. And so that's my biggest concern with these types of fixes, is that we will think that we've accomplished something when, as I pointed out, a lot of these things, like you can ban chokeholds, cops are still using chokeholds. They're going to use them. They're particularly going to use them on people that they don't think have the people who, black and poor people. They're going to particularly use them against the most vulnerable people still. Um, and with no-knock warrants, I talked about that already. Um, and there's very little evidence that body cameras actually reduce incidents of police brutality. I have a lot of there's a lot of reasons for why that's true. Um, and so the one thing that I will say I think there is some promise in is the ban on qualified immunity, which would have to happen at the at the level of federal Congress. So the U.S. Senate and Congress would have to pass a law saying there's no qualified immunity. For people who don't know what qualified immunity is, very quickly, it's if a police officer violates, or anyone, but we'll talk about police officers, violates my constitutional rights, perhaps by searching my house without a warrant, I can sue them under what's called 1983, which is a federal statute that allows people to sue when their constitutional rights are violated. Police officers have qualified immunity in those civil suits, and what that means is that they have a whole is that means that if I want to sue them, have a bunch of extra procedural hurdles that you wouldn't have if I were suing like a company whose toaster blew up in my face. I have a whole bunch of extra things that hoops I have to jump through, and evidence I have to show before that police officer even gets deposed, before my lawyer even gets asked that police officer a question.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that does is it makes it very costly to bring lawsuits against police officers, and it means they almost always win, like the overwhelming amount of the time. So the ban on qualified immunity is what it would do, that I think is slightly more than just saying no chokeholds, is that it would give some amount of institutional power to people who are victimized by police officers. And it would remove a little bit of institutional power that police officers currently have. I don't think it's by any stretch of the imagination like a fix all, and I suspect that the courts will, as they did with the creation of qualified immunity in the first place, will find other ways of protecting law enforcement. The courts in the United States are just extremely pro law enforcement, partially because judges are all former prosecutors, but it's another aspect of the deep institutional interconnectedness of these policies and practices. But I do think it would at least offer a temporary shift, or at least a shift in power that immediately might have some consequences that would be good.
But going back to the sort of train of your thinking, that this really doesn't address anything about the point or the mission of policing in the United
Right.
States, which is, to put it, I think in another way that you were saying, was that policing is about protecting the security of privileged populations in the United States from various kinds of criminalized or suspect populations. Its job is to provide comfort for a small group of people in the United States, and changing various policies doesn't really change that mission in any sense.
Right.
What you say in your article is that part of it, what needs to happen, is that we need to understand that the cost of providing this kind of security and comfort is too high. And I wonder whether that leads you to think that what we need to think about is either defunding or abolishing the use of urban police forces in order to achieve racial justice.
Mhm.
Right? If policing is inherently oppressive, does racial justice require that we talk about police abolition? That is, removing this institution whose mission it is to use state sanctioned violence against certain groups of people to protect the comfort of a smaller group of individuals.
Yeah, so I think the morally uh, required stance is an police abolition stance. And I would say, to further nuance a few things you said, I don't think it's just urban police forces. I think rural police forces are incredibly destructive to poor folks of all races, but even like poor white communities. Um, and I think the level of violence is not nearly as high as it is toward Black and Indigenous people in the United States, but it is still it's incredibly destructive. Um, so I would say racial justice requires that, but also I don't think that it is only Black and Indigenous people who are criminalized, in my terminology, who are treated as though they are criminals. Um, homeless populations and also are. I'm in Seattle, and that's just a constant justice battle. And in rural areas, I think also that can be also true in rural areas with regard to poorer folks. So I think it's an issue of justice altogether. And so I think in the short term, immediate abolition seems unlikely. I think the defund models are great, and I think those are the most promising. And I think we should always ask when any kind of legislation is coming forward that purports to be limiting police or to somehow be ending some of these bad policies. We should definitely look and see, do those laws also include a ton of grant money for police departments to just have a lot more money? Because oftentimes, you know, a solution that ends up getting put forward by state and federal legislatures is, oh, well, let's give the police more money to train themselves to do better on this. And police training, police equipment, it actually is just a really large shift of money toward police. And so I think the defund model is really important because we don't want our policies that are supposed to rein in the power of police to actually just take money that could go to other things and give it to police to train themselves, to monitor themselves, which is just I think already been shown to not work. So.
So, if I understand correctly, you don't do this in your paper, but I wanted to sort of explore this idea with you about what you think the just future should be, and it's one, if I read you correctly, one without the institution of policing,
Mhm.
in which we have had some kind of deliberation about what community safety and security is, and that the enormous amounts of money that are going into funding this violent institution are being funneled into ways that provide other forms of security that are more equitably distributed across communities, and trying to make sure that more people than just simply a small minority of already comfortable people have abilities to access mental health,
Mhm.
employment, housing, and all these kinds of things. Is that the vision of the just future that you're thinking about when you think about police abolition?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I share this with many abolitionists uh, of all different camps. Um, I think I have a hesitation, which is that we often talk about redirecting money um, toward education and social work and health and mental health, and I think that's absolutely what we need to do. Just a word of caution that I think sometimes we get too excited about is those institutions in the United States are also really full of really bad
Right.
racism and
Right.
classism. And so, I think we also, you know, have to be really cautious about how we start funding those institutions as well. But there's all kinds of evidence that a dollar spent on education, in certain communities saves, $4 in uh, uh, criminal stuff later on, like criminal law enforcement later on. There are some really pretty straightforward things we can do to decrease violent crime in the United States, and they're not rocket science like a lot of other countries rely on these things. And those are jobs programs, education, big social safety net. Those kinds of things like will immediately um, bring less violence to communities, and so I think we can start there. And I do think it's a long the utopic future is a pretty far it's a long ways away, and I think we have to also contend with, as I said, the types of oppression that exist in those other parts of the those other institutions in the United States. So I think absolutely it's possible. I think it's a long road, um, and but I think that we start by defunding police and funding education and healthcare, and we start really looking at how to get root racism and classism and ableism out of those institutions as well.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing that point up. I mean, I think that in stuff that I've looked at from the Chicano and the Puerto Rican liberation movements from the 60s and 70s, there's a lot of discussion about police brutality is one thing, but also we need to be concerned with the school counselors and the social
Yes,
workers in our communities, right? Just
yes,
shifting
yes.
money away from one state institution to another doesn't necessarily uh, ease the oppression and the oppression intervention in communities. And so they're
Yeah,
often backed by the violence of police officers. So we have to be
yeah.
very careful about this, that we're often talking about the state as a much bigger sort of purveyor of oppression. And then
Hmm.
maybe an alternative is to think about community-based forms
Hmm.
of safety and comfort, right? Not always thinking about what the state can offer.
Yeah, absolutely.
You raised this kind of question too. I want to sort of winding this down. You prefaced this at the beginning by saying that your analysis was mostly about the use of policing as an institution in the United States, and many of our examples we were talking about were from the United States. You of course, just mentioned now that in other societies there's bigger safety social nets, and that results in different kinds of crime statistics.
Hmm.
Um, is policing an oppressive institution only in the United States, or is it inherently universally an oppressive institution no matter where you find it in the world?
That's a really good question, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I personally, I limit my claims to the United States context, partially because I'm just not an expert on the way police work in other societies. But I think if I've been largely talking in what I call non-ideal theory, and so I do think sometimes certain philosophers have defended against, for example, prison abolition by saying, well, we can imagine a prison system that is not super oppressive. And that's possible. Like, sure, maybe. I'm just not concerned with that. So on the one hand, I want to say, like, on the ideal theory level, speaking to political philosophers out there, on the ideal theory level, maybe we can imagine a system of policing that isn't inherently impressive. Um, it's certainly not in the United States. Um, but I also think, often to bring it back down to actually existing societies, um, there are police in, you know, Northern Europe who seem to do very little harm to the best from what we can tell. Um, I think Norway, like they had one police killing in like a decade. And again, very small prison populations, and their prisons are much different than American prisons. They don't have body cavity searches and violence. They're just much different places. And I think if if we could magically replace what we have in the United States with that tomorrow, I think I most of us would probably be pretty happy. I don't know. Those are just different societies that don't have the same history of settler colonialism as the United States has. So while I am sort of interested in the things that Northern European um, criminal systems have been able to do, I'm hesitant to draw too big of lessons from them for the United States context. Sorry, there's a siren in my neighborhood.
Ironically.
Yeah, to highlight.
Yeah.
Um, so I think all of that is to say, I tend to want to limit my claims to the United States, um, and partially just because I'm that's where my expertise lies.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say, Dr. Wirtz, thank you very much for going through this conversation with me. I'm just wondering too, like in your own work, where are you going now with some of this stuff? What's
Mhm.
the next step for you in terms of your work and your research in this area?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm working on right now is what the implications of this view are for pursuing uh, gender justice, particularly thinking about how to address gender-based violence, rape, domestic abuse, and so forth. So outside of philosophy, I think there's been a rising critique of what's called carceral feminism, which is the idea that we solve gender oppression. One of the tools that we can use to solve gender oppression is the criminal law. So we should be prosecuting more rapists and, expanding the definition of rape and, all these sorts of things. And there's been a critique of that that's happened largely outside of philosophy by feminist theorists in a variety of disciplines. And what I want to do is I want to think about that debate that's happening within the context of mainstream philosophy of criminal law and punishment, and think about how what some of the typical justifications for punishment and criminal law are there, and sort of see what can we learn about those typical justifications um, from the critique of carceral feminism. So that's my current project. So, yeah.
Wow, that's very cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, Dr. Wirtz, thank you very much for spending some time with us to help us understand some of these ideas, and uh, look forward to some of your new work on this material into carceral feminism. But appreciate your time, and thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you having me.
And thank you all for sharing your time with us. If you have questions or thoughts about police abolition, go ahead and give us a comment. Leave us a comment down below or send us a comment through social media. You can find us at the Anarres Project at anarresproject.org. You can also find us on all the socials. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can also find our audio podcast at anchor.fm or on Spotify and on a variety of different places where you find your podcasts today. So thank you all. Dr. Wirtz, thanks very much.
Thank you.